Hello and welcome to The Climb. My name is Luke Walton and I'm a producer leading a small team that runs the Pitch Film Fund. The Climb is a new step for us. Rather than inviting filmmakers to find anything of interest that they find within the scriptures, we want to look at one short set of verses and see if filmmakers can bring dramatic life to a text known as the Beatitudes. And to embark on this mountainside climb, I have with me, and I'm delighted to welcome our three fellow travellers and experts for today. Ginny MacDonald, Director of Theos, the London-based think tank, Rebecca Eklund, Associate Professor of Theology at Loyola University, Maryland, and author of The Beatitudes Through the Ages, and Sam Wells, Vicar of St Martin's in the Fields since 2012. They're all authors, all familiar and participate in media. Welcome to The Climb. Now, by way of introduction, could I ask each of you to say what your kind of interest or fascination might be in the Beatitudes? Rebecca, you've written endlessly. I shall come to you first.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure endlessly, but I did write a book. I got really interested in the history of how the Beatitudes have been understood and interpreted and applied throughout history. I actually, my entry point into the Beatitudes was the blessing on those who mourn. I was doing work on what's called the prayer of lament, which is the kind of prayer of complaint or crying out to God for help. So I was looking at all the texts in the New Testament that have to do with mourning and lament and grief. And I kind of came across the blessing on those who mourn. And I thought, why? Why are those who mourn considered to be blessed? And we can talk more about the word blessed because that's a kind of loaded religious word. But I just got super interested in it and I dove in and 5 years later I had a book. So that's my kind of interest in them. Yeah.
Chinny,
Thank you.
the Beatitudes, are they of interest to someone in a political think tank?
Oh, absolutely. I think part of what we do at Theos, so we are a religion and society think tank, and we try to think about the ways in which religious ideas, kind of honed over centuries, and particularly Christian ideas, might help us to think about how society might function well today. What does human flourishing look like today? And we move beyond the kind of party political and try to think about the kinds of values that might exist in the society that might lead us towards certain ways of being or certain ways to be human. So really interested in the Beatitudes in helping us think about some of those ideas about human flourishing and a well-functioning society. Also, I'm just interested in storytelling and painting pictures that communicate profound truths. So we're a think tank, but I try to ensure that we do our think tanking in creative ways through kind of using the arts, thinking about kind of public engagement and how to really cut through in a really noisy world.
Sam, you work in the heart of the city and work amongst some of the poorest in the city as well. What's your particular interest with the Beatitudes?
Well, they have been described as the most important words spoken by the most important person who ever lived. So if you've got a short attention span, this is probably the place to start. And I'm fascinated by the way you can read the Beatitudes as Jesus's autobiography, that he's really describing himself. He's been all of the things on the left-hand side, if you like, and he is promising life for us to share with him on the right-hand side. And as I understand it, what I call the comma, and I know there wasn't any punctuation in the original manuscript, but what I call the comma is the place where we dwell between the cross on the left-hand side of the comma and the resurrection on the right-hand side of the comma. So in a sense, I see them as a summary of the gospel, and a shorthand of the gospel, and a as brief an autobiography of Jesus as we could possibly imagine. As far as my own context is concerned, yes, I probably step over a homeless person when I leave the house, probably 2/3 of the mornings of the year. And that's particularly prevalent at the moment in the period post-COVID. And it's, I guess, what I'm looking at when I'm looking at the the left-hand side, as I've called it, the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek. Those are the people that I'm looking at when I walk out of my house each morning.
Now, we are going to set out what these Beatitudes are. We've been quite enigmatic, left and right, and so on and so forth. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I want first to it'd be great to set the scene for when these are given by Jesus. Sam just mentioned that. Rebecca, could you help us set the scene? This is first century Israel, occupied Palestine, Roman Empire. What's happening in Galilee at the time? Because these are given in Galilee. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So they're spoken in Galilee, which is a province of the Roman Empire, like you said, and this is where Jesus was born. This is where he grew up. This is where his ministry was located, and that's really interesting because it's not the power center. Galilee is considered a kind of backwater, if you will. I mean, this kind of nothing province of the Roman Empire. All the power structures and the elites and the money is in Judea, because that's where Jerusalem is, that's where the capital is, that's where the temple is. But that's not where Jesus operates for the most part. He operates in Galilee, very rural, small towns, farming. And so one of the things that I always tell my students is to understand the world of Jesus. You really have to understand two overlapping and intertwined worlds, which is the world of the Roman Empire and the world of Judaism. So of course Jesus was Jewish. I think it's oddly easy to forget that, to think of Jesus as sort of a Christian, but he's so grounded in Judaism, which is his faith, his religion, right? This is what he was raised in, and the Beatitudes themselves are very grounded in the world of Judaism, but they're also given against the backdrop of the Roman Empire. This is occupied territory, and it's uneasily occupied territory, I would say. In the decades before Jesus is born, and then even when he is growing up, there are little revolutionary movements that sort of flare up and get immediately stamped out by Rome, because Rome does not tolerate, insurgency. So you have this kind of uneasiness, I think, to the occupation of Rome. There's lots written about, kind of the crushing taxation that people experienced. So there's a lot going on with that. But then you also have the Beatitudes really flowing out of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish scriptures. And the Beatitude itself is, I don't want to go on and on because I could, so please stop me if I go on too long, but the Beatitude itself is an existing genre. This is not something that Jesus made up. It's a genre that you see in the Psalms in the Hebrew Bible. It's something you also see in classical literature. So you see this in like classical philosophical literature at the time. And I love that Chine talked about human flourishing a little bit ago. And that's exactly what the Beatitudes are about. A beatitude is an identification of a way to flourish, a way to be a good way to live in the world that leads to a rewarding and fulfilling life. And one of the things that's so surprising about the Beatitudes is because they don't seem immediately like what we might identify as a good way to live. It's not the blessing on the rich or powerful, it's the blessing on the lowly and humble. So that's just a little bit of the background.
That's really helpful. And who's listening to these when they're given? I mean, we're looking particularly at the way Matthew curates this. So this is coming right at the beginning of Jesus's public ministry. But who's gathered around him? Who's listening?
Absolutely. So it's a great question, because you have two different audiences there. So the way that Matthew narrates this is that Jesus has his disciples with him. So he's already begun to call disciples. And the word disciple really just means student, someone who is kind of following Jesus, observing him, learning from him. He's teaching them both with his words and with his actions. So he's developed, this little group of close, students essentially around him. So his disciples are there, but it also says the crowds are there. And when the Gospels use the words, the crowds, it's kind of their way of representing just people in general, just kind of everyday, normal people, probably for the most part Jewish, although we also know that Galilee is a region where there was a significant Gentile or non-Jewish presence. So, but just crowds of people are there listening to these along with the disciples. So you kind of have this two-layered set of people listening to it.
Sam, you've mentioned the sort of two halves of the Beatitudes. What are the Beatitudes? How are they structured?
Well, they come in what I would call three parts, and I'm fascinated to hear Rebecca talk about that as an existing genre, because I wasn't really aware of that before Rebecca's work. But the first half is pretty miserable. It's this contrast. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek. You know, they're upholding the lowly, as it were, as blessed, which is counterintuitive. And then the second speaks of their reward. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven, for they will be comforted, for they will inherit the earth, and so on. And then in between, you've got this comma, this pause, which of course isn't in the Greek, but it's very much there in the English translations. And I was very struck. I had a conversation with Tom Holland, the celebrated historian, just a few days ago about. I was asking him what is, why were so many of the early Christians martyred? Why did they go to their death, and why did Rome want to kill them? And he was making the point, as I think Rebecca's just been saying, that the distinctive, the radical thing about Christianity in the first century was its incredible equalization or upending of social hierarchies. That Rome was an extremely hierarchical society. Your senator was top of the tree, and your slave girl was bottom of the tree. And for a slave girl to embody these Beatitudes and then be regarded as a martyr if she died, as some did, horrible deaths because of their faith, then in a sense it's a complete reversal of the status quo. It's an upending, and very much as Mary's song in the first chapter of Luke's Gospel is in a very similar way. It's a transformation of society. So just in these 8 or arguably 9 pithy sayings, society is completely turned upside down. And again, not just now, but forever, because there's a future orientation to Jesus's promise here. But they come in two halves. The blessed of the people in what we would think of as a desperate plight, and then the great reward, the great joy that lies ahead of them.
Ginny, I wonder if I could bring you in there, because that talk of upending kind of political status quo, I'm just intrigued by how you react to that, and whether you think they still have that sort of dynamic today, or whether you think that the biggest impact was back then.
I think, like most of the Bible, there are things that we can learn today, or we can take from, that can help us think about how society might function and what human flourishing might look like. But I'm really interested in the kind of, if you think back through history, the kind of big kind of historic moments. When Sam was talking about the slave girl and kind of Roman times who might be martyred, I think about the enslaved people during the transatlantic slave trade who had, versions of the Bible, who might have read this and resonated with some of those, some of the Beatitudes. So kind of the first half, but those on the left-hand side might have thought, well, maybe this is speaking to me as opposed to my slave owner. So there's something about the Beatitudes which is radical in that it upends the status quo. It says, kind of politically, if we think about politics around the world, whether that's in the global north or the global south, the political leaders, or those who kind of enact or create the societies that we live in, are those that are powerful, those that have it all together, those who tend to be rich, tend to be educated, tend to show no sign of weakness or vulnerability. But what this is saying is that actually it's the other way around. God sees, Jesus sees those who are at the bottom of society. Now, without getting kind of party political, that tends towards a certain kind of political worldview that says actually there should be an equalizing of society, that there should be a kind of eradication of this kind of sense of hierarchy. And you see that throughout Jesus's ministry, this kind of critique of those who have power, those who are at the top, and this elevation of those who are at the bottom, this complete kind of reversal of the status quo. So one thing that I think that the Beatitudes say to me about what a good society might look like is one in which kind of fragility, vulnerability, and brokenness are things that are seen and not necessarily valued as kind of virtues and things that we should seek. They are not necessarily good things, but a society that in which people who are in those positions are elevated is one in which actually all of us are, because if those at the bottom are looked after, then we all are. So there's something in that about the kind of upending of the status quo, which I'm sure that those who are listening at the time would have found surprising, because it didn't necessarily resonate with the picture of power or society that they saw around them.
So we're getting a sense then that these are offering hope to some of the people at the bottom of society, and have done and continue to do so. But it's not only for them as well, I suppose. It is actually a challenge to everybody. And what you're saying is, if we're doing this kind of attention, if somehow these are embodied in life, life will change for the whole of society. Which is really fascinating to think about, as of 8 phrases, and how remarkably powerful that can be as a vision for how life could be going forward. I just want to go back to you, Sam. How do they work? You mentioned that there's kind of 2 halves to them, and that you described kind of the condition now and the promise. But what I mean is, if you were learning these, were you supposed to kind of tick them off one by one? Is somebody who wants to be a disciple, as Rebecca was describing it, somebody who follows Jesus, if you're wanting to be keen about this, are you supposed to tick them all off? Are you supposed to collect the badges, the Beatitude badges, or are they something that you are constantly revisiting and thinking about in the way your life lives? How do they work?
I think they form the imagination. I always say about Christian ethics that it's really all happens in the imagination. So to give an example, that example I mentioned at the beginning, if I'm meeting a person experiencing homelessness in central London, these are supposed to shape my imagination. So I could say, this person's a basket case, this person's got all kinds of problems, why can't they sort their life out? I could say, this is a person experiencing profound grief. This is a person experiencing deep isolation. This is a person who perhaps didn't die at the hands of their parents in some ghastly situation the social workers had failed to prevent, but had somehow miraculously survived. And this is the life that they lived coming out of such a difficult situation. So I see the true human being rather than the label or the problem that might be perceived they might be perceived to embody or represent. That's the left-hand side. Mm. And then I see, as Chine was saying, these are the people closest to God's heart. These are the people with whom Jesus spent most of his time among us. These are the people in whom the resurrection is most visibly enacted. These are the people in whose faces Christ is most evidently found. I don't think I have to memorize them. I don't think I have to be able to recite them. I don't think I have to say, oh, number 4, that's the big one for me. I think I just have to allow the Holy Spirit to form my imagination, so that when I meet a person who clearly represents the left-hand side, I see, if you like, the heavens open, and what the Spirit is doing, and what the Father is promising them on the right-hand side.
Chinny, I think what Sam's just said is fascinating, but I want to come back to you and ask, are these then just for the faithful, or do you think they have something to say to everybody? And if so, how does that work? Do I have to have the kind of Holy Spirit or some position of faith to take these on board? Or do you think there's something for all to investigate here?
Well, I think there's absolutely something for all. I think about what these kind of headings might look like today, or on Twitter or on Instagram. What does it mean to be meek or poor in spirit or mourn? I loved what Sam said at the start about Jesus's life having in some way kind of reflected or been through all of these and left. And so for me, there's something about the universality of the human experience, and the fact that there are things in there that actually we can all kind of grasp in some way what it is to mourn. Now, whether you are materially rich or materially poor, we all kind of have a sense of grief or loss, or the kind of negatives about what it is, what the human condition experiences. So these are kind of universal human experiences and feelings. As a Christian, the beauty for me is that God, through the incarnation, through becoming human, through Jesus, also experiences those. So there is something to be said for all of us, not just those who are Christian or who might pray that the Holy Spirit might help us to kind of experience these things, but that Jesus himself speaks to all of these things and speaks to all of us. And the kingdom of God is one that welcomes all. So I know that we might come back to maybe the meaning of blessed in this context and what it means. But my understanding is that it's not necessarily that you are what we call on Instagram #blessed, that you've got it all sort of together, but you are that, hey, you're like, you're welcome, like you're in, like, and people who might be experiencing these things might not necessarily recognize those and feel a sense of, what, me? Am I blessed when I'm kind of mourning or poor in spirit? And that for me speaks to the heart of what it is to be, what the Christian story is, this kind of radical, open-armed welcome, no matter the situations that we're going through, some of which might be shocking and horrific and painful, that we are welcomed in.
Let me just come to you, Rebecca. Is blessing the right word? It says happy in one of the versions I have on my desktop. Happy is the person who's mourning, but blessed is the more normal one. How do we understand that word? Can you build on that? Is that welcome? Brilliant.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's so interesting, because one of the things I did when I was working on my book is I went and I looked at every translation I could get my hands on, both in English and in other languages, limited by the languages I speak or have friends who speak who could help me. But because I was so curious, I was so interested in how you do this, because it's actually a very difficult word, I think, to capture in English. I think blessed, it has such religious baggage on it. Do you know what I mean? It can sound a little pious, or so that's not quite helpful, I think, in some contexts, especially for a certain audience. Happy is a little better, but happy is also such a light word in English. It's I'm happy, but that's ephemeral. It goes away. I'm happy and then I'm sad. And so happy kind of captures it, but it certainly captures the paradoxical nature of it. Happy are those who mourn is just like a collision, of two things. I've seen it translated congratulations to, congratulations to you. Fortunate are the, flourishing are the ... And I think all of these capture something about what this genre is, this little mini genre, the Beatitude, and what the Greek word makarios is trying to do. It's saying this, if you are this way, good for you. This is the way to live. This is the good way to live. This is the path to a truly fulfilling and happy life. So I think there's a number of ways to work that out in English, but you almost have to paraphrase it a little bit, I think, to capture its full meaning. But I did want to also add, just very briefly, I completely agree with Janae that there's kind of universality to these. And I think part of that is even signaled by the two audiences. You asked me about the audiences earlier, and just the fact that Jesus delivers them to the disciples and the crowds kind of shows that he didn't gather his disciples in a room and say, now these are just for you. This is kind of a secret or insider teaching or something. I've heard the Beatitudes described as an invitation. And I really like that they're a kind of open invitation to anybody who wants to hear them.
How have the interpretations changed over the centuries? Because you've looked at kind of the global voices of global north, south, east, west, and across genders as well. But the interpretations of these have changed over the centuries, haven't they?
They certainly have. Although, there's also a kind of stability to them in some ways that I find interesting. I mean, some of that is just because, the blessing on the merciful. Mercy can have a lot of layers. So certainly people are exploring the layers to mercy as forgiveness, mercy as, helping the needy, mercy as kind of radical inclusion for the excluded. But exploring the many layers doesn't mean that you can sort of throw out what the word mercy means kind of in its base. Do you know what I mean? So there's all this beautiful variety, but also a kind of stability, if you will, about them. But certainly they've changed over time. I think for most of history, because they were so central to the church and so central to Christian understanding, they were really understood as the sort of heart of the Christian way of life. So there were times, I think, when you lost a little bit of that sense of their universality. And certainly in the modern era, the universality of them has certainly been recovered. So there's lots of ways that I could talk about. The meekness is the one that kind of blew my mind. That was the one that really amazed me. That one has changed the way we understand it, partially because I think we lost the Greek. We lost what the Greek word meant when it got translated into English. The word meek is so different from what the Greek word means. So that one changed more, I think, than the others.
Can you just, for those who wouldn't know, how's that?
I know that was such a teaser.
But that was just we got to ask you that question. Come on, come back on that.
Of course, yeah. So what I discovered is that all the way up until about the 1700s, more or less everybody who read the Beatitude, with some small exceptions, but the vast majority of interpreters understood meekness to be the proper use of anger. It's a kind of self-restraint. It's a decision that you make not to hurt somebody. When you have the right to strike back, or you have the power to strike back, you choose to restrain yourself. So I really like the word gentle instead. Blessed are the gentle, because we still use the word gentle actually as a verb, right? To gentle a horse. Maybe that's not super common anymore, but we still kind of use this as a way of talking about the restraint of something kind of powerful and dangerous. And so meekness was, this goes all the way back to Aristotle, who discussed meekness as, the virtue in between never feeling angry, which is the deficiency, right? To never feel angry at anything is a problem. There are some things that you should feel angry about. But then the excess, the problem on the other side, is to fly off the handle at everything and to hold grudges and, to feel deep anger at small, silly things. And so meekness is really the virtue of being able to hold yourself in check and to be gentle, and to not use your anger to harm another person.
We're thinking about bringing these to filmmakers, and how might filmmakers imagine them visually and envision the dramatic that would bring some of these statements to life. And the enigmatic, of course, is quite attractive to the filmmaker, gives lots of room for creative interpretation. But they haven't featured greatly over the centuries in fine art, have they, Rebecca? There are well, I think you've written on 3 paintings that I think managed to span 1,000 years. Can you do 1,000 years in 3 minutes? I don't know that, but I give you the challenge.
I'll do my best. So I've been involved with this wonderful project called the Visual Commentary on Scripture, just to give them a little pitch. And as part of that project, I was assigned to find 3 artworks that somehow represented the Beatitudes. And this is much more challenging than, say, the Annunciation, where there's 1,000 paintings of the Annunciation, right? The angel's announcement to Mary. But what I found is that certainly once you start looking for the Beatitudes, you can really find them in art in really interesting ways, partially because they've been personified in medieval art as 7 women who represent 7 virtues. So once I realized that, I started seeing them all over the place in medieval art in ways that I didn't even realize what I was looking at. So that's the first piece, was this illumination from a beautiful medieval manuscript depicting the 7 Beatitudes. 7, it's too long to tell you why there are 7 in the medieval imagination. It has to do with Saint Augustine. As gardeners who are watering a garden, and the virtues are trees that are sort of growing up from the water of the Spirit being poured into the roots of these trees. So that's a kind of one lovely image. The Beatitudes are actually the trees that grow, and the gardeners are the people who pray, and the water is the Spirit. And then you have one of my favorite artists. I'll just jump to the modern one. I'm going to skip the Ghent altarpiece for now because I'm running out of time.
Let's do that. That's good. Laura James.
Yeah. So Laura James is one of my favorite artists. She's a wonderful artist. She uses traditional Ethiopic images in her art. And she has painted the Beatitudes as a series of panels, where each panel is drawn from the transatlantic slave trade. And Jesus is depicted as an African man delivering the Beatitudes to enslaved Africans in chains. And it's such a wonderful way to visually represent the Beatitudes are for them. And Jesus is one of them, right? Because he's also an African. So he's aligning themselves with the enslaved and saying, these blessings are for you. And there are slaveholders in some of the panels, and they kind of represent the flip side of the Beatitudes. Like, if the blessing is on the merciful, there's an implied warning, right, against the merciless. And there's one panel actually that has a white man hiding 2 slaves in the bottom of his boat and ferrying them presumably to safety, rescuing them from their enslavement. That's the merciful. So there's one instance in which you have such a way of, I'm not saying this very clearly, but you get to imagine where you find yourself in relation to the Beatitudes in these panels. And you're asked very clearly, am I on the side of the enslaver or the oppressor? Or am I going to align myself, or do I find myself in a situation where I am the oppressed? And the Beatitudes are sort of forcing you to make that choice in the way that Laura James depicts them so beautifully in these panels.
Sam, people wandering around in the crowd hearing these words, how quickly would this have caught on as being something quite radical and different? How would word have spread on this?
I think we've got to think about 2 levels of dissemination. We've got the oral tradition, in which Jesus clearly must have said things like this many, many times in many, many places. There's no TV, there's no radio, there's no way of taking what's been said in one context and then translating it verbatim into another. And so he must have said these things on a number of occasions. And you simply saw the change in people's lives. And if you think of the parables, which are familiar stories of an upside-down kingdom, and if you think of the miracles, not so much necessarily as one-off events in the life of individuals, but as enacted parables, visible descriptions of the transformation in people's lives and in society of what Jesus was talking about, then I think you see statements like this and the parables and the miracles in some ways as 3 sides of a triangle. And they're all portraying a very, very different way of relating to authority, of anticipating the future, and of dealing with serious economic disadvantage and oppression. But then there's a second level, and that's the written document. And if we imagine Matthew writing down somewhere in the 70s, shall we say, AD, then you're it was a moment of revelation for me when I realized how the Gospels came to be written. People may be familiar with the practice of Lectio Divina, where you read out a Bible passage and then you all say out loud one word that really struck you, and then you read it again, and maybe you read out a sentence and talk about why that struck you. And it was a real penny drop moment for me when I realized this is how the Gospels were written. They were written in communities that cherished their memories of what Jesus had said and done, and then they slightly corrected each other, and they said, no, he didn't say the poor, he said the poor in spirit. No, he said the poor. And he probably said both at different times, and Matthew records the distillation of the wisdom of people's memories of what he said, but also what happened on the back of what he said, the transformation that took place after he'd said it, after he'd done it, and so on. And so I think you've got the oral tradition and then the written tradition, both of which turn the world upside down.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Sam. And Chinny, just thinking about dissemination today, in a funny sort of way, of course, there are absolutely Bibles everywhere. You could steal a Bible and no one's coming after you. You can take it out of the hotel room and they'll probably just be pleased you took it. What is the dissemination of these things today? Do you think we find them overlooked in the film world? Do you think things like this are overlooked in the political sphere?
It's interesting. I think some of the ideas that are around in kind of political thought, people don't know where they came from. They don't kind of necessarily know the origins. They don't know that they come from traditions of people who kind of really wrestled with passages like these, or kind of whose whole kind of political thought and ideologies were based on the Bible. Now, there are traditions, and groups within political parties now who kind of very much still think about the Bible, but there are some for whom these ideas sound good, but they don't necessarily know where they come from. On the dissemination idea, thinking about it today, I've been thinking about people like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate, or people who are gaining massive followings among groups that really are desperate to hear their messages. Now, we may agree or disagree with what they're saying, but I'm really interested in the way that these ideas spread, how people wouldn't necessarily have read the books that Jordan Peterson has put out. They wouldn't have read them word for word, but someone would have told them, having heard from someone else, the things that this guy was saying. So because of the way that the Bible is written, actually many decades after Jesus lived, they come from people having heard and been impacted and changed by the messages, and then passing them on. So there's the kind of written tradition, as Sam says, but there's also the kind of the oral, the passing on that comes from transformed lives and ideologies and thoughts.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm afraid our time has run out, and much though I should love to go on talking with our guests, it remains for me to thank you for joining us on this, the first of our journeys through the climb. I hope you'll come and join us again and hear more, and you'll be intrigued to discover more about these stories through the series of 8 short films that are to follow. It remains for me to thank Rebecca, Chinny, and Sam for their time. Thank you for joining us. And if you have been, thanks for listening.